Hello, and welcome to my very first virtual A&S class. I am Lloyd Bartholomew Sharp. Today I will be taking you through the step-by-step process of how to create 16th century thread-wrapped buttons such as these. To begin with, I'd like to show for you three different styles of thread-wrapped button which existed in the 16th and 17th century. The one which we will be focusing on today on how to make is this simple one. It is thread wrapped over a wooden bead. It's created by making ribs and then backstitching around it. This other style, which can be seen here, is actually a basket weave. Again, it's created over a wooden bead, but you're simply weaving the threads in and out, whereas this one where you are actually stitching around the ribs. This last style here is essentially a knotwork button. You can see that the threads are woven in and around each other. This one I'm only just learning and I'm not going to focus on. I'm not very good at it. This is actually, I'm forming this over small felt balls so I can actually stitch my way through it. Materials you will need in order to make thread wrapped buttons. First and foremost, we have the wooden cores. Now, I buy these beads in large packages of mixed sizes. You can get them at anywhere, basically any kind of arts and crafts stores. They are relatively inexpensive. I think I paid about $10 for maybe 500 of them of mixed sizes. The three sizes that I normally work with are 8, 10, and 12 millimeter. I actually don't have a 10 mil here, but that's an 8, and that's a 12 mil. In period, it seems like most of them are fairly small. When looking at information from the Victoria and Albert Museum, the majority of them seem to fall into the smaller size when you're looking at like doublet buttons, anywhere between anywhere between say 6 all the way up to about 12 millimeter. That's your foundation. Now next, thread wrapped button, you need thread. My personal favorite, and because I generally are making these for what would be a higher class of outfit, is 20/2 silk thread. This happens to come from White Wolf and Phoenix. I don't remember where they got their supplier is. Your other options, though, if you're just starting out, which is what I did, regular DMC pearl cotton. This is perfectly acceptable. It makes a nice button. The only thing that the silk is a little bit better at, other than it is actually a period material, is that the silk will actually lay flat over the bead and give you a much more even coverage than the cotton, which tends to retain its very round thread form. If you are going to be making, say, a lower, not lower class, but sort of middle of the road or up and coming, you could use something like this linen. This is 16/2 linen thread. This will also make a really nice, very sturdy bead. The needle is very important. I've messed around with a lot of different styles. Generally, I like a fairly heavy needle. Because you're going to be working this through and around the button, you don't want a needle that's going to bend or, snap off. There's a fair amount of tension by the time you're getting towards the bottom of the button. It actually becomes very difficult to push it through, so it really helps to have a much larger and heavier gauge needle than you would for, say, generalized sewing. In bead making, they generally refer to or button making, they generally refer to basically anything to hold the button or bead on as a mandrel. I just use skewers. They're cheap, they're plentiful. Only word of warning is that you don't you don't want to risk breaking this off on the inside of the bead, because then you basically have to start all over again. Alright, so let's get started with the actual making of a thread wrapped button. I am actually working on a 10 millimeter bead here. I am working on a set of buttons for a coat, 17th century coat that I'm making at the moment. The first thing I do grab my bead, and I will actually take the skewer and force it through the inside and try and, you'll see on this one that there's actually obstructions right here. So it really, you don't want your thread catching on that. So just clear out, make sure that the inside of it is all cleared out first. I'm going to draw, I'm going to thread my needle. Now, you need a fairly long strand of thread. For a 10mm bead, I start out with about a yard of doubled over thread. At the end, you want to put a very secure knot, because you'll be actually pulling this fairly tight. You want to make sure that knot is not going to give on you. First pass, just come up through the needle, thread it through, and loop. Well, can if I don't lose my finger hold. And then push back through. You want to try and get that knot down into the middle. This is what I was saying, where you really want to tie a very secure knot, though, because you don't want it to actually pull through. Let's continue to form the ribs. I normally like to do it in quarters first and then come back through. The buttons that I am making will actually have 8 ribs in total. You can get away with as little as 6. It's actually, I find it a little bit easier. The more ribs you have, the easier it is to keep the tension even over the whole bead. I apologize, my hands are moving all over the place. This is the first time I've attempted to make one of these videos, so. Again, I'm trying to keep it as even as I can as I'm going. I'm trying to make sure the spacing is even. Can help to actually pick up a bit of the previous rib as you're going through. That helps to kind of lock the thread in place as you're going along. Make sure we're good. I got 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 8 ribs. Starting at the base of the bead. Oh, first, I'm actually going to slide it onto the skewer. It just gives me a handhold. It gives me something to hang on to as I'm stitching. And now, it's just a case of back stitching your way all the way around the bead. The first couple passes are actually some of the hardest, just because you're trying to get underneath that rib that you've cranked down to begin with. Once you've gotten those first ones on, though, it really goes much faster. One word of caution here, make sure that when you do it, you are actually going completely under the thread. You can see that there. You don't want to split the thread, because then you won't be able to move it up the rib as you're working, and you could end up breaking either the rib or the main line there. But you just keep going around and around and around. Whee, and fling it off your mandrel. Well, I skipped ahead a bit just so you don't need to see me stitch the entire button. I've switched the button over on the mandrel just so it allows me better access to the lower portion as I'm stitching. Again, just continuing. You can see my thread is starting to get a little bit snarled here. I've tried doing this with wax, and generally the button just doesn't look as nice in the end, so try and just keep your thread under control as you go. Getting down to these last couple turns is where the heavier gauge needle really pays off. You really are going to find that you've got a lot of pressure and a lot of tension on it, and this is where I have snapped off plenty of needles. I did try blunt needles to see if that would help. It actually doesn't. While it's a little less likely to split the thread of the ribs, it essentially just makes it even harder because most blunt needles are much too heavy a gauge to really get underneath the ribs down at the base here. Jump camera angles there again, just so I can try and show you what I'm doing a little bit better. But you just keep on back stitching until you've filled up. Basically, you may have a little bit where you'll be able to see the original wooden bead underneath, but the goal is to try and get as much of it covered as humanly possible. So I still have a few more turns left here. But, so again, you can see why the mandrel is useful. You can just kind of spin it in your fingers, and it allows you to keep working. Again, you can see how much more difficult it is to get it through these last stitches in the base. Take off the mandrel here at this point. One more. Alright, so that's covered up. Just pass your thread through, make sure you pick up some of the initial rib thread just to help lock it in place. And then we can move on to the next portion. Alright, on the home stretch now, we've got what I'm going to do now is create the sort of the decorative ribs as well as leaving the tail end of silk, which will actually form the shank of the button when it's attached to the finished garment. So that's the bottom. You can see where I brought the thread out from completing the wrapping. So I'm going to start at the top of the button and push it through. Again, this is doubled over 220 silk. doing this as an alternating color just to add a little bit of, artistic flair to it. So it's come out the bottom. You can see the little valleys formed by the ribs here. Well, you could if I'd move my hand. So you've got the valleys that run in between the ribs. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the thread, go over it, pick up basically just the first little bit, go across, do the same thing on the other. Well, do it a little bit neater than that. Pull through. Pick that up right there. I'm going to go around and get that fluff off of my button. Come around, and you're just going to repeat the process of picking up a little bit there, picking up another little bit on the other side, going between the ribs and the little valleys formed. It's just a question of filling in all of the ribs. I don't worry too much about the bases. They're going to be covered over when I actually create the shank for the button, so I don't actually worry as much about how the bottom's going to look because it won't be visible. And I severely doubt most of the period ones had very nice looking ones either for that reason. Doesn't really matter what order you do it in. It is easier just to keep going on, on opposites, but should be my last there. So you can see that's all formed now. Now I'm going to go from the bottom through the center, pull it up. Now a lot of the buttons in period actually they have a little decorative knot on the top. In fact, there's the coat that I'm working on now, the buttons that were found on it actually had a little bit of decorative brass or copper wire wrapped around just for that added little flair. In this case, most of mine, I just put a knot. In this, you can use whatever knot you want, just as long as it forms that nice little, button on the top. Bullion knot works well. You can do it, depending on what kind of thread you're using. You might be able to even get away with just a French knot. But I find the bullion knot to generally be most useful. So you can see that I'm formed that, and then I will just pass, or try and pass, the needle back through the center. And leaving me with a nice little knot on the end of it. So you're going to want to leave the tail end long, because as I said, that'll be used to actually create the shank of the button when it gets stitched onto the garment. But that's it in a nutshell. That is a 16th and 17th century thread wrapped button.